Hello everybody, greetings to you all. In this video, let us discuss some of the important characteristics of language. To begin with, let us try to answer the question, what is language? Everybody knows the answer to this question, but nobody has so far been able to come out with any standard definition that fully explains the term language. It is like a situation trying to define the term life. Everybody knows what life is, but one cannot present a satisfactory definition of life. In order to understand a term like life, one has to talk of the properties or characteristics of living beings like reproduction, respiration, growth, power of self-healing, nutrition, mortality, etc. Similarly, the term language can be understood better in terms of its properties or characteristics. Some linguists, however, have been trying to define language in their own ways. Even though all these definitions are far from satisfactory, here are some of these definitions. Language is a symbol system based on pure or arbitrary conventions, infinitely extendable and modifiable according to the changing needs and conditions of the speakers. This is the definition given by Robbins. According to this definition, language is a symbol system. Every language selects some symbols for its selected sounds. These symbols form the alphabet of the language and join in different combinations to form meaningful words. The system talked of here is purely arbitrary in the sense that there is no one-to-one correspondence between the structure of a word and the thing it stands for. The combination of letters P, E, N, for example, stands in English for an instrument used for writing. Why could it not be EPN or NEP? Well, it could also be EPN or NEP, and there is nothing sacrosanct about the combination PEN except that it has now become a convention that cannot be easily changed. Language conventions are not easily changed, yet it is not impossible to do so. Language is infinitely modifiable and extendable. Words go on changing meanings, and new words continue to be added to language with the changing needs of the community using it. Shakespeare, for example, used the word stomach to mean courage. Similarly, words like laser, Sputnik, and astronaut are of quite recent origin in the English language. The next definition given by Sapir is that language is a purely human and non-instinctive method of communicating ideas, emotions, and desires by means of a system of voluntarily produced symbols. There are two terms in this definition that call for discussion: human and non-instinctive. Language, as Sapir rightly said, is human. Only humans possess language, and all normal humans uniformly possess it. Animals do have a communication system, but it is not a developed system. That is why language is said to be species specific and species uniform. Also, language does not pass from a parent to a child. In this sense, it is non-instinctive. A child has to learn language, and he or she learns the language of the society he or she is placed in. The next definition given by Hall is that language is the institution whereby humans communicate and interact with each other by means of habitually used oral, auditory, arbitrary symbols. This definition rightly gives more prominence to the fact that language is primarily speech produced by oral auditory symbols. A speaker produces some string of oral sounds that get conveyed through the air to the listener who, through his hearing organs, receives the sound waves and conveys these to the brain that interprets these symbols to arrive at a meaning. The next definition is that a language is a set, finite or infinite, of sentences, each finite in length and constructed out of a finite set of elements. It's the definition given by Noam Chomsky. Chomsky meant to convey that each sentence has a structure. Human brain is competent enough to construct different sentences from out of the limited set of sounds or symbols belonging to a particular language. Human brain is so productive that a child can at any time produce a sentence that has never been said or heard earlier. The next definition states that a language is a system of arbitrary vocal symbols used for human communication. Another definition states that a language is a system of arbitrary vocal symbols by means of which a social group cooperates. Both the definitions 5 and 6 prominently point out that language is a system. Sounds join to form words according to a system. The letters K, N, I, T join to form a meaningful word knit, whereas combinations like NKIT or TKNI or INKT do not form any meaningful or sensible combinations. As said earlier, although initially the formation of words is only arbitrary, convention makes them parts of a system. Words too join to form sentences according to some system. A sentence like cricket is a game of glorious uncertainties is acceptable, but one cannot accept a string of words like a game is of cricket uncertainties glorious. It is in this sense that language is said to be a system of systems. Another definition states that language is undoubtedly a kind of means of communication among human beings. It consists primarily of vocal sounds. It is articulatory, systematic, symbolic, and arbitrary. Derbyshire, while accepting that language is the property of human beings and that it is primarily speech, brings out the point that it is an important means of communication amongst humans. Before the start of civilization, man might have used the language of signs, but it must have had a very limited scope. Language is a fully developed means of communication with the civilized man who can convey and receive millions of messages across the universe. An entire civilization depends on language only. Think of a world without language. Man would only continue to be a denizen of the forest and the caves. Language has changed the entire gamut of human relations and made it possible for human beings to grow into a human community on this planet. Now, the next definition is language is a system of conventional spoken or written symbols by means of which human beings, as members of a social group and participants in its culture, communicate. Languages are the principal systems of communication used by a particular group of human beings within the particular society of which they are members. It is clearly evident from all these definitions, none of which completely defines the term language, that it is not possible to have a single definition that brings out all the properties of language. On the basis of these definitions, one can, however, list out the various characteristics of language. It would therefore be better to list these characteristics and discuss them in detail. Characteristics of language. The first and foremost point is that language is a means of communication. Language is a very important means of communication between humans. A can communicate his or her ideas, emotions, beliefs or feelings to B as they share a common code that makes up the language. No doubt, there are many other means of communication used by humans, like gestures, nods, winks, smiles, braille, alphabet, symbols, sirens, sketches, etc. But all these systems of communication are extremely limited, or they too in turn depend language only. They are not so flexible, comprehensive, perfect and extensive as languages. Language is so important a form of communication between humans that it is difficult to think of a society without language. It gives shape to people's thoughts and guides and controls their entire activity. It is a carrier of civilization and culture, as human thoughts and philosophy are conveyed from one generation to the other through the medium of language. Language is ubiquitous in the sense that it is present everywhere in all activities. It is as important as the air we breathe and is the most valuable possession of man. In the scheme of things, all humans are blessed with language, and it is the specific property of humans only. Language is thus species specific and species uniform. It is because of the use of language that humans are called talking animals. Animals too have their system of communication, but their communication is limited to a very small number of messages like hunger, thirst, fear and anger. In the case of humans, the situation is entirely different. Human beings can send an infinite number of messages to their fellow beings. It is through language that they store knowledge, transfer it to the next generation, and yoke the present, past, and the future together. The next feature of language is that language is arbitrary. Language is arbitrary in the sense that there is no inherent relation between the words of a language and their meanings or the ideas conveyed by them. There is no reason why a female adult human being be called a woman in English, Stri in Hindi, Aurat in Urdu, Zen in Persian, Femine in French, or Tinvi in Punjabi. Selection of these words in the languages mentioned here is purely arbitrary, an accident of history. It is just like christening a newborn baby, John or James. But once a child is given some name in a purely arbitrary manner, this name gets associated with the child for his entire life and it becomes an important established convention. The situation in the case of language is a similar one. The choice of a word selected to mean a particular thing or idea is purely arbitrary. But once a word is selected for a particular referent, it comes to stay as such. It may be noted that had language not been arbitrary, there would have been only one language in the world. The arbitrary nature of language permits or presupposes change, but such changes do not normally take place. Names once given are not normally changed. Words in a language are more difficult to change because a whole society has accepted them. Therefore, while the arbitrary nature of language permits change, its conventionality gives it stability. Language is a system of systems. Language is not an amorphous, disorganized, or chaotic combination of sounds. Any brick may be used anywhere in a building, but it is not so with sounds or graphic symbols standing for the sounds of a language. Sounds are arranged in certain fixed or established systematic order to form meaningful units or words. Similarly, words are also arranged in a particular system to frame acceptable, meaningful sentences. These systems operate at two levels, phonological and syntactical. At the phonological level, for example, the sounds of a language appear only in some fixed combinations. While there are several English words having an initial consonant cluster with 3 consonants. There are no initial tetraphonemic consonant clusters in English. Similarly, words too combine to form sentences according to certain conventions. The sentence, "The hunter shot the tiger with a gun," is acceptable, but the sentence, "Hunter The hunter shot the tiger with a gun" is acceptable, but the sentence "Hunter the tiger a shot gun with the" is not acceptable, as the word order in the later sentence does not conform to the established language conventions. Language is thus called a system of systems as it operates at the two levels discussed. This property of language is also termed duality by some linguists. This makes language a very complex phenomenon. Every human child has to master the conventions of the language he or she learns before being able to successfully communicate with other members of the social group in which he or she is placed. Language is primarily vocal. Language is primarily made up of vocal sounds only, produced by a physiological articulatory mechanism in the human body. In the beginning, it must have appeared as vocal sounds only. Writing must have come much later as an intelligent attempt to represent vocal sounds. Writing is the graphic representation of the sounds of the language. Graphic symbols had to be invented for the sake of some sounds. There are a number of languages which continue to exist even today in the spoken form only. They do not have a written form. A child learns to speak first. Writing comes much later. Also, during his lifetime, a man speaks much more than he writes. The total quantum of speech is much larger than the total quantum of written materials. It is because of these reasons that modern linguists say that speech is primary, writing is secondary. Writing did have one advantage over speech. It could be preserved in books or records. But with the invention of the magnetic tapes or audio cassettes, it has lost that advantage too. A number of modern gadgets like the telephone, the tape recorder, the dictaphone, etc., prove the primacy of speech over the writing in the present time. Language differs from animal communication in several ways. Language is primarily human. It is humans alone that possess language and use it for communication. Language is, in that sense, species specific. It is specific only to one set of species. Also, all human beings uniformly possess language. Thus, language is species uniform to that extent. Animals also have their own system of communication, but communication between them is extremely limited. It is limited to a very small number of messages. Animal communication differs from human communication in the following ways. Language can convey a large number, rather an infinite set of messages, whereas the number of messages conveyed through the communication system of animals is very limited. Animals, for example, are able to convey to their fellow animals if they are hungry or afraid. A bee, by its dance, is able to convey the distance or the direction of the source of nectar, but it cannot convey how good or bad this honey is. Similarly, a bee cannot tell another bee that the source of honey is 10 meters to the left of a point, 15 meters to the right. Language can thus convey messages along several directions, whereas in the case of bees, messages are differentiated along two dimensions only, that is, direction and distance. Some monkeys, it is known, can produce a number of sounds to express fear, aggression, anger, love, etc. But these messages too are extremely limited in number. Language makes use of clearly distinguishable, discrete, separately identifiable symbols, while animal communication systems are often continuous or non-discrete. Animal communication systems are closed systems that permit of no change, modification, or addition. A bee's dance or a cock's crow is today the same that it was 200 years ago. It is not so in the case of language. Language is changing, growing every day, and new words continue to be added to it in the course of time. Words like Sputnik, laser, video, software did not, for example, exist anywhere in English language 300 years ago. Language is thus open-ended, modifiable, and extendable. Human language is far more structurally complex than animal communication. English RP variety, for example, has 44 sounds that join in different groups to form thousands of words. These words can be arranged into millions of sets to frame different sentences. Each sentence has its own internal structure. There is no such structural complexity in a lamb's bleating or a monkey's cry. Human language is non-instinctive in the sense that every human child has to learn language from his elders or peers in society. This process of learning plays an important part in the acquisition of language. On the other hand, bees acquire their skill in dancing as humans acquire the skill to walk. They are sometimes seen to make hexagonal hives. They do not learn any geometry. Their knowledge is inherited, inbuilt. It is not so in the case of human beings who have to learn a language. Displacement. Animal communication, as in the case of communication system in birds, dogs, monkeys, insects, etc., is limited to or related to their immediate time and place, here and now or near about. It does not contain any information about the past or the future or about the events taking place in the distant multidimensional setup. When your pet animal produces a sound, a cat mews or a dog barks, you understand the message as relating to your immediate present and place at the moment. It cannot tell you where it was 2 days ago, or where it would be in the evening, or where it was up to in the next few minutes. Human language users are capable of producing messages pertaining to the present, past, or future, near or distant places, that is, in a multidimensional setting. This property is called displacement. It allows the users of language to talk about things and events which are not present in the immediate environment of the speaker. Animal communication lacks this property. Even if some animals do display this property of displacement in their communication system, the messages are extremely limited. A honeybee can, for example, convey the distance and the direction of the source of nectar, but it cannot tell another bee that it should first turn right for a distance of 10 meters and then fly across the left wall into a well in the rose garden on the east. The property of displacement in human language enables us to talk even of things, persons, or events that are non-existent or imaginary or are likely to be found on other planets. Language is a form of social behavior. Language has to be learnt. This learning is possible only in society. A human child learns to speak the language of the community or the group in which he or she is placed. A Chinese infant, if placed in an Indian family, will easily learn to speak an Indian language. He or she picks up the language of the social setup in which he or she grows. Language is thus a form of social behavior. Language is a symbol system. A symbol is a concrete event, object, or mark that stands for something relatively abstract. Similarly, words are symbols that stand for objects. The symbol TABLE stands for an object consisting of a wooden board supported by 4 or 3 legs. A speaker or a writer wants to communicate with another fellow being, puts his message across in the form of symbols in speech or writing. The receiver of the message, who shares a common code with the sender of the message, decodes this message sent in the form of symbols and interprets these to arrive at a certain meaning. Thus, language is a symbol system, though different languages use different symbols. Productivity. Language is creative and productive in the sense that a user of a language does not always produce only sentences that he has heard or learnt previously. On the basis of his knowledge of the grammar and syntax of the language, he can always produce new sentences, write new poems, or produce many other kinds of new literature. He can produce an infinite number of sentences as per the eventuality he is facing within the framework of the grammar of the language being used by him. This property of language is called productivity. Interchangeability. It is an important characteristic of human language that it permits a speaker to become a listener and vice versa without impairing the function of language, that is, communication. This property has been named interchangeability. It can also be called reciprocity, that is, any speaker or sender of a linguistic signal can also be a listener or receiver.